He was sent to teach survival on a distant, hostile planet, but what he discovered was far greater than danger or wilderness. In a place where machines failed and fear ruled, one man chose firelight over fear and instinct over data. His presence didn't just change the way they lived. It awakened something ancient, something powerful, something human. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and show a thumbs up by liking the video. Now, let's jump into the story. The transport vessel rattled through the thick clouds of Aurelia 7, its metal frame creaking under the strain. Ronan Vale stood near the viewing window, eyes fixed on the emerald surface below. The jungle spread out in all directions, wild and untouched, like a living ocean of green. Most would have felt fear looking down at that chaos, but not Ronan. For him, it was the first real thing he'd seen in weeks. The training centers back on the lunar base were clean, sterile, and perfectly safe, but they were lifeless. This place, though? This place was breathing. The shuttle landed with a hiss and a jolt. As the doors slid open, a thick wave of heat and damp earth rolled in. The smell hit hard, wet leaves, old roots, something sour and something alive. Ronan stepped out, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, boots sinking slightly into the moss-covered ground. A group of colonists waited for him at a distance. Their suits were thin and gray, their eyes shielded behind small visors. They looked more like lab workers than settlers. One stepped forward, tall and stiff. He introduced himself as Administrator Island and offered a small nod instead of a handshake. "Specialist Ronan Vale," Island said, his voice flat. "We appreciate your presence. The colony has been under strain." Ronan glanced around. The structures behind them were all the same silver pods lined up in neat rows, perfectly clean, perfectly cold. No signs of children, no plants, no color. The jungle had stopped right at the edge of their settlement, as if it had been warned not to come any closer. "Show me where you want me," Ronan replied, not interested in small talk. Island raised an eyebrow, but turned and motioned toward a pod labeled Field Operations. Inside, the temperature dropped. Screens covered the walls, displaying environmental data, humidity percentages, wind patterns, and something called predator proximity risk. The colonists kept their distance from the jungle. Ronan could already see the pattern. They weren't living on the planet. They were hiding from it. "We've lost 4 to wildlife attacks in the past 2 months, Island said. 2 more from toxic plants. We had misread the biochemical scans." Ronan didn't respond. He looked past Island, toward the thick tree line just beyond the base. He could hear it, the constant whisper of wind through massive leaves, the clicks and calls of things unseen. The jungle wasn't the enemy. It was just waiting to be understood. "How often do you send people beyond the barrier?" Ronan asked. "Almost never," Island replied. "We use drones for observation." Ronan gave a small shake of his head. "Machines don't feel the ground. They don't smell rot. They don't know when something is watching." Island frowned. "We prefer caution. It's not caution, it's fear." Without another word, Ronan walked out of the operations pod and crossed the clearing toward the edge of the colony. The colonists stared from behind their visors, but said nothing. He passed the housing unit he'd been assigned and kept going. At the far side of the clearing, beneath the shelter of a twisted ridge tree, he stopped. The ground here was soft, but stable, and the canopy offered some protection from the rain that was always waiting to fall. From his duffel, he pulled poles, a tarp, and a small coil of rope. In a matter of minutes, he had a basic camp set up, open to the air, nothing artificial except the tarp overhead. He gathered rocks for a fire pit, stripped bark from a nearby tree, and prepared a pile of kindling. He didn't use a lighter. Instead, he struck a flint against his blade until sparks danced. It took longer, but it wasn't about speed. It was about rhythm, patience, respect. By nightfall, a soft fire crackled at the center of the camp. The colonists stood at a distance, whispering. One stepped forward, a young girl with pale blue markings along her cheeks. Her name was Kira. She stared at the fire like it might bite her. "You won't use the colony shelters?" she asked quietly. "No need," Ronan said without looking up. "Out here, I can hear what's coming." Kira tilted her head, confused. "Hear what, wife?" She didn't reply, only stepped back slowly and returned to the others. As the sky turned a deep purple and the sounds of the jungle grew louder, Ronan cooked a simple meal over the fire. Dried protein strips mixed with a paste made from local leaves he'd crushed earlier. He'd tested it on his skin, no sting, no rash. Safe enough. He ate alone, eyes half closed, listening. The forest spoke in clicks, howls, and the slow groaning of trees. But beneath all that, there was a rhythm. A language. One pair of eyes watched him closely. Kira again. Ronan glanced up and gave a single nod. She didn't come closer, but she didn't leave either. That was enough. The colony had brought him here to teach survival. But survival wasn't about tools or tech. It was about listening, adapting, becoming part of the world instead of fighting against it. And tonight, with the fire casting long shadows on the tree trunks, Ronan knew the real work was just beginning. The next morning, the jungle was already awake when Ronan opened his eyes. The fire had burned low, but the embers were still warm. Mist hung low to the ground, softening every sound. He didn't speak. He never did first thing in the morning. Listening came first. The jungle was louder today. Clicks, whistles, a long, slow howl from somewhere deep beyond the ridge. He smiled slightly. That meant something had moved into the area overnight. Not a threat yet, but something to watch for. He stood, stretched, and made his way to the edge of the clearing. The colonists were just starting to stir. They moved like machines, quiet, cautious, heads down. Kira was the first to step out of her pod. She looked toward him, uncertain. Ronan nodded once. She hesitated, then walked over, careful with every step, like the ground might suddenly bite. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ronan was kneeling in the dirt, fingers brushing the soil. "Smelling the ground." She blinked. "Smelling?" He scooped up a handful of earth and held it to his nose. "Damp, but clean, no mold. That's where we'll dig for roots." Kira watched him for a moment, then crouched beside him, copying his motion. Her fingers were stiff, unsure. She didn't speak again, but her eyes followed everything he did. By midday, they had a small pile of edible roots and fibrous bark stacked neatly near the fire pit. Ronan showed her how to strip the bark, how to crush it between stones to release the sap, how to test it on the skin first before tasting. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated, then stepped back. She caught on quickly. No one had ever shown her like this before. More colonists began to appear, drawn by curiosity. A boy named Ryo came first, silent and pale. Then an older woman called Mirren, who carried a pair of worn field gloves but had no idea how to use them. They didn't speak much, but they didn't leave her. They sat in a loose circle, not quite part of it yet, but getting closer. That night, Ronan built the fire again, using only what they had gathered. No one offered help, but none of them walked away. The flames danced, casting long shadows over the camp. Kira sat beside him now, less afraid. Ryo had brought a few dry twigs and handed them over without a word. Mirren was still watching from a few steps away, her face hard to read. The silence held for a while, until Kira finally whispered, "Why don't you use the tech?" Ronan turned a stick in the fire. Because tech doesn't teach you to feel. And if you don't feel the world around you, you won't survive in it. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood. But she stayed close, and that said more than her words. Later that evening, a low growl echoed from the trees beyond. The clearing. All the colonists froze. A few stepped back. Ronan stood slowly, head tilted to one side, listening. He didn't panic. He didn't even reach for a weapon. He just waited. Then the growl faded. What was that? Ryo asked, his voice shaking. Curiosity. Ronan said, not hunger. If it had wanted you, it wouldn't have warned you first. They didn't sleep easily after that, but none of them returned to their pods. They stayed near the fire, lying on blankets or leaning against trees. The jungle had scared them. Yes, but it had also started to speak to them. And Ronan had taught them to listen. The next day brought new challenges. The food supply in the colony was low, and they needed to start finding local sources. Ronan led them to a thicket of wide-leafed shrubs. He pointed to the tips of the leaves, where tiny red veins pulsed. This one's dangerous, he said. Looks fine, smells fine, but the red means it defends itself, burns the tongue, causes swelling. How do you know that? Mirren asked, stepping closer. Because it lied, Ronan replied. Most edible plants want to be eaten. They don't hide. He picked another nearby plant and held it up. This one had dull blue veins and a soft, waxy feel. This one's safe. Tastes bitter, but keeps your stomach calm. By now, the others were paying full attention. They weren't just watching, they were asking questions. They took notes in small journals. Kira started copying Ronan's actions exactly, repeating his steps until her hands moved with confidence. Even Ryo tried his hand at cutting sap from a branch, his fingers trembling. That night, more colonists joined the fire circle. They brought wood, water, and one even brought a musical device, small, handmade, and shaped like a hollow tube. Mirren used it to tap gently on a log. A soft rhythm formed, almost like a heartbeat. Ronan didn't stop her. He smiled quietly and kept stirring the stew that now bubbled over the fire. You're not like the others they sent before, Kira said, watching him. No, he said. I don't come to fix systems. I come to show people how to live in the world they already have. She thought about that for a long moment. Then softly, she said, I think the world has been waiting for us to listen. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The fire crackled between them, and the jungle around them pulsed with quiet sounds, alive, alert, and aware. Something was changing. The colony wasn't just surviving anymore. It was starting to breathe, and it had only just begun. By the third morning, the colony felt different. It wasn't loud, not in any obvious way, but something had shifted. The once empty clearing now held tools made from branches, bowls carved from thick leaves, and bundles of vine cord drying on. Rocks near the fire. More colonists moved with purpose, not routine. They didn't just observe Ronan, they followed him. And for the first time, they looked like they belonged. Ronan didn't lead with speeches or plans. He just woke early, moved through the jungle, and returned with knowledge written in the dirt and ash. A young boy named Lowen had started joining him. At first, the boy stayed a few steps behind, quiet, awkward, unsure of his footing on the uneven forest floor. But now he tried to match Ronan's pace, copying his crouch when they stopped to listen, his steps when they crossed over roots and moss. Lowen had once been scared to leave the pods. The idea of touching the forest had made him flinch. But after a week near Ronan's fire, after meals cooked over flame and stories told under the stars, his fear had changed into something else, something like curiosity. Ronan never praised him. He didn't need to. Lowen could feel it in the way Ronan handed him a tool instead of taking over. The way he nodded without smiling when Lowen did something right, the others noticed too. Kira now moved like someone with purpose. She had started marking trees with symbols, tracking safe paths with colored sap. Mirren had organized a group to collect edible roots and learn to distinguish between those that soothed the stomach and those that made it twist. Even Island, the administrator, had begun to appear more often. He didn't speak much, and he never sat, but he watched the fire from the edge of the clearing. His eyes were tired. He wasn't ready to admit the change, but he saw it happening. Evening, as the sun sank behind the tree line, a long cry echoed from the east. It was deeper than any they'd heard before, almost a song, but too wild to be made by anything human. The firelight flickered across worried faces. A few colonists rose and looked toward the jungle, tense. Ronan listened carefully. "It's not hunting," he said. "It's warning something else." "What would scare something like that?" Mirren asked. Ronan didn't answer. He didn't need to. The jungle always knew more than it showed. That night, they stayed up, later than usual. Kira told a short story about her first day on Aurelia 7, how the silence had felt heavier than the air. Lowen shared a dream he'd had about a tree that grew light instead of leaves. Someone laughed quietly. It wasn't a big laugh, but it was real. And for these people, that was enough. The fire burned lower, and the sounds of the forest filled the silence between stories, chirps, whispers, crackles of moving leaves. Ronan leaned back on his elbows and let the noise settle around him like a blanket. These moments were the most important. Not the lessons, not the survival tips, but this people remembering how to exist with the world instead of just inside. At dawn the next morning, the fire was already cold when someone noticed Lowen wasn't there. His spot near the stones was empty. His tools were still stacked neatly nearby, untouched. Ronan stood quickly, eyes scanning the shapes in the mist. "Where is he?" he asked. "He said something about bark," Kira replied. "From the north side of the stream, for the nets." Ronan didn't wait. He grabbed his pack and knife and strode toward the forest. Yanni, one of the quieter colonists, stepped up beside him. "I'm going with you," she said. Ronan looked at her for a second, then nodded. "Stay close." The forest past the safe zone was thicker than the area near the camp. Vines hung like curtains, and the roots twisted underfoot. The air smelled sharper here, like wet stone and old fruit. Ronan moved quickly, but carefully, scanning the ground, looking for signs. After 20 minutes, they found a broken trail bent leaves, a scuffed patch of soil, and a thin piece of fiber cord caught on a low branch. Ronan crouched and touched the ground. "He passed through here," he said. But something startled him. "See the prints?" He ran. They followed the trail deeper until they heard a weak voice calling out. "Here, I'm here." Lowen was pinned under a fallen branch, not hurt badly, but stuck. His foot was twisted under the weight, and he looked more embarrassed than afraid. Ronan and Yanni worked together without a word. They cut away smaller branches, used fine rope to brace and lift. When Lowen was free, he sat in the dirt, breathing hard. "You all right?" Ronan asked. Lowen nodded. I thought I heard something and turned too fast." Ronan looked around. The jungle was quiet, but not still. Something had passed through, large enough to knock down a limb that size. "Next time," Ronan said softly, "you don't go alone." They returned slowly. Back at the clearing, the colonists gathered around, worried. Lowen didn't speak. He didn't have to. Ronan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and everyone understood. This wasn't about blame. It was about learning. That night, no one asked for stories. They just sat quietly, watching the flames. The jungle was louder than usual, but the fire was brighter too. Ronan stared into it, knowing the colony had taken another step, not just toward survival, but toward something deeper. They were no longer afraid of the silence. They had started to hear the sound beneath it. The morning came wrapped in fog. The mist rolled through the trees and blanketed the clearing in a soft white veil. It dulled the light, softened the edges of everything, and made the air feel heavier than usual. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Colonists stirred slowly, blinking against the damp. Ronan was already awake. He sat at the edge of the camp, crouched low, his eyes locked on the jungle beyond. Something was different. The rhythm of the forest, the clicks, the distant howls, the rustle of leaves had shifted. It wasn't louder, just unfamiliar, like a song played with a new note. Behind him, Kira pulled her blanket tighter and stretched with a yawn. She noticed his tense posture. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice still rough from sleep. Ronan didn't answer right away. He pressed 2 fingers into the soil and brought them to his nose. The smell was off. It carried a sour twist beneath the usual scent of moss and earth. He stood slowly and looked around. "Where's Lowen?" he asked. Kira froze. She glanced toward the fire, where Lowen usually sat each morning. His tools were untouched. His spot was empty. Around the camp, others were waking and beginning to realize the same thing. Faces turned. Eyes met. No one had seen him since the night before. "Last I heard," said Mirren, stepping forward. He mentioned checking the bark supply near the stream. Something about needing fresh strands for the net. Ronan was already moving, grabbing his pack and securing the strap of his blade. He didn't hesitate. "He's been out there too long. I'm going." "I'll come with you," said Kira, already pulling on her boots. "No," he said firmly. "I need speed, not a group." She opened her mouth to argue, but stopped. She knew better now. This wasn't about pride. It was about time. The jungle swallowed him as soon as he passed the boundary. The mist clung to every branch and vine, wrapping around him like a curtain. Each step was careful. He paused often, crouched low, eyes scanning the ground. He found Lowen's trail quickly, a snapped branch, a muddy footprint, a scuff against tree bark. The boy hadn't panicked at first. His trail was clean, deliberate. But farther in, the signs changed. The steps were uneven. A mark in the soil showed where he'd fallen. Something had startled him. Ronan pressed on. The jungle grew thicker. Sounds became muffled. Then, a voice soft and weak called out from the distance. "Here. Down here." He turned sharply and followed the sound until he found Lowen half buried under a cluster of thick roots. A limb had collapsed beside him, pinning one leg. His face was pale, but he was alive. Ronan didn't waste a second. He knelt beside the boy, tested the weight of the branch, and whispered, "You're going to be fine." Using a vine as a brace, he looped it around the largest root and pulled, slow and steady. The branch shifted with a groan. Lowen winced, but stayed quiet. When the limb finally gave way, Ronan helped him sit upright. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I think so," Lowen whispered. "Just twisted, not broken." Ronan nodded. "Let's go. This area's too still." They didn't speak much on the walk back. Ronan supported Lowen with one arm as they moved through the undergrowth. The jungle seemed to watch them, but stayed silent. No animal sounds, no wind. Just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. When they stepped out of the tree line, the entire colony was waiting. Relief flooded their faces. Kira ran forward and helped guide Lowen to a resting spot near the fire. No one asked what had happened. They didn't need the details. He was back. That was enough. That night, the fire was larger than usual. not for warmth, but for comfort. The colonists sat in a wide circle. Some held carved instruments made from logs and hollow reeds. One by one, they began to play. Soft beats, uneven but growing stronger, layered with gentle taps and rustling shakes. It wasn't music by any rule, but it had rhythm. It had life. Ronan sat quietly, letting the sound wash over him. Lowen sat beside him, his leg wrapped, but his eyes wide with wonder. Kira handed Ronan a small object, something she had woven from vine and bark. A bracelet. It wasn't much, but it was carefully made, every strand pulled tight with care. "For you," she said, placing it in his hand, "so you remember you're part of us now." Ronan looked at the bracelet, then at the people around him. These weren't the same colonists he had met weeks ago. They no longer feared the jungle. They no longer hid behind walls. They had begun to live with the world instead of away from it. He tied the bracelet around his wrist and gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said later, when the fire had burned low and most had drifted into sleep. Ronan remained awake. He watched the shadows dance against the trees and listened to the jungle's quiet hum. It didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like a voice that had waited patiently for someone to hear it. The forest didn't need taming. It needed company, understanding, respect. And now it had all three. For the first time, Ronan thought maybe this place didn't just need him to survive. Maybe it needed him to stay.